She heard everything. Every cold, calculated word her fiancé spoke to his family. She is nothing but a mistake. Cut through the marble walls of that mansion like a blade she never saw coming. Elena Whitlock stood frozen in that hallway, the antique fountain pen she'd saved 3 months to buy pressed against her palm, and made a choice that would shatter 2 lives and secretly create 2 more. She walked away without a word. But walking away didn't save her. It only delayed the collision. If you've ever loved someone who let you down in the worst possible moment, stay with me. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. Elena Whitlock had a habit of arriving early to everything. Her mother used to say it was a kindness, giving the world a few extra minutes to prepare for you. Her older sister called it anxiety dressed up as manners. Elena had never been able to decide which one was right, so she did what she always did with uncomfortable truths. She set it aside, straightened her dress, and showed up early anyway. She arrived at the Ashcroft estate on a Thursday evening in late October, 40 minutes before the dinner was scheduled to begin. The car service Adrian had arranged dropped her off at the iron gates, and she told the driver she'd walk the rest of the way up the gravel path because the evening air was the kind of cold that felt clean rather than cruel, and she wanted a moment inside it before she had to become presentable. The Ashcroft property sat on 3 acres in the kind of quiet that money builds specifically to separate itself from everything else. The main house was Georgian Revival, white limestone and tall arched windows, and from a distance it looked the way power always looked when it wasn't trying, effortless, inevitable, faintly threatening. Elena had been here twice before, both times with Adrian at her side, his hand a familiar pressure at the small of her back, steering her through rooms that never quite stopped feeling like they belonged to someone else. Tonight she was alone, and the house looked different. She followed the path around the east side of the building, planning to enter through the garden entrance Adrian always used, a wide glass door off the terrace that stayed unlocked when family was expected. She could hear voices ahead, low and measured, the kind of conversation people have when they think no one is listening. She almost kept walking, should have. Instead, she stopped just before the corner of the house, her heels quiet on the stone, because she caught her own name. Not the way people say a name when they're welcoming you, but the way they say it when they're making a decision about you. Elena is not a consideration. The voice belonged to Margaret Ashcroft, Adrian's mother. Elena had met the woman 3 times. Each time, Margaret had smiled at her with the specific warmth of someone who has decided you are temporary. She never was. Mother, that was Adrian. His voice was tight, controlled, the version of himself he used when he was working to keep something contained. Don't. Margaret cut him off cleanly. We've moved past the point where sentiment is useful, Adrian. The Hargrove Agreement requires your presence and your commitment, and that requires a certain image. Elena Whitlock is a kindergarten teacher from Brooklyn. She is charming, I'm sure. She is also entirely unsuitable. Silence. Elena pressed her back against the limestone and breathed carefully through her nose. She's going to be my wife, Adrian said. The pause that followed was brief and absolute. No, Margaret said. She isn't. And you know exactly why, so stop performing grief for an audience that isn't here. Another voice, younger, edged with something almost gleeful. Declan, Adrian's younger brother. She's a mistake, Adrian. That's all she ever was. A temporary lapse in judgment dressed up in a nice dinner reservation. Tell me you haven't actually convinced yourself otherwise. Elena's chest locked. She is nothing but a mistake, Adrian said. 3 words that arrived in a specific order, quiet, deliberate, without hesitation. Elena waited for him to say something else, to walk it back, to qualify it, to give her some thread of context she could pull until the sentence unraveled into something she could survive. He didn't. What followed instead was the low sound of Margaret Ashcroft expressing something that might have been satisfaction, and then the conversation pivoted, onto Hargrove Industries, onto a contractual timeline, onto names Elena didn't recognize and didn't need to. She stayed against the wall for a full 30 seconds after their voices moved inside. The fountain pen was in her purse. She'd spent 11 weeks deciding what to get Adrian as an engagement gift. Not a ring, obviously, because the ring had come from him. A pale sapphire set in platinum that she privately thought was too large but had never said so. She'd settled on the pen, a Mont Blanc Meisterstück, vintage 1962, the kind of object that existed long before either of them and would outlast the occasion regardless of what the occasion became. She'd found it at an estate sale in Park Slope, spent a week having the nib reconditioned, and wrapped it in the kind of brown paper her mother used to use for gifts because she thought it was warmer than a box. She took it out of her purse. She walked to the garden entrance, opened the glass door quietly, and set the pen on the small side table inside the entryway. It made a soft sound against the wood. She looked at it for a moment, the weight of it, the clean gold clip, and then she walked back out, pulled the door closed behind her, and kept walking. She went the long way around the property, back to the iron gates, back to the gravel path, and she called a car because the evening air had stopped feeling clean. She did not cry in the car. She sat with her hands in her lap and watched the city reassemble itself around her as they drove back toward Brooklyn, and she thought, with the specific clarity that follows a blow you didn't see coming, that she should have trusted the feeling she'd had the first time she'd met Margaret Ashcroft. The feeling that she was being evaluated, not welcomed, that there was a version of this ending already written, and she'd been the last to read it. Her apartment was on the 4th floor of a walk-up in Carroll Gardens. She'd lived there for 6 years, long enough that the stairs had stopped feeling like effort and started feeling like punctuation, a brief physical transition between the world and her own particular corner of it. She unlocked the door, stepped out of her heels in the hallway, and sat down on the edge of her bed in the dark without turning on a light. She sat there for a long time. The thing about Elena Whitlock was that she was not naive. She'd grown up in a household where money was always slightly tighter than anyone admitted, where her mother worked 2 jobs for most of Elena's childhood and never complained about either of them, where the lesson passed down wasn't about aspiration so much as endurance. She'd gotten a scholarship for her undergraduate degree, put herself through a teaching credential on a combination of loans and summer tutoring, and had been in her classroom at PS 130 for 4 years by the time she met Adrian Ashcroft at a fundraiser she almost didn't attend. She knew what she was. She'd never been confused about it. What she hadn't known, what she'd allowed herself to briefly, catastrophically not know, was what Adrian was. She was still sitting on the edge of the bed when her phone lit up with his name. She watched it ring. She didn't answer. He called twice more before midnight. She turned the phone face down and lay back on top of the covers, still in her dress, and closed her eyes and worked on breathing the way you work on breathing when you've had the air knocked out of you and haven't quite figured out how to get it back. She slept eventually. Badly. The kind of sleep that isn't rest so much as a brief ceasefire. Morning arrived gray and insistent, the way October mornings in Brooklyn often did, light pressing through the blinds at an angle that illuminated the dust on the windowsill and the stack of children's books on her nightstand and the half-empty glass of water she'd forgotten to drink. Elena lay still for several minutes, running through the previous evening the way you run your tongue over a broken tooth, methodically, cataloging the damage. She got up, made coffee, sat at her kitchen table. The fatigue she'd assumed was grief revealed itself, over the course of that first cup, to be something else entirely. Her body felt foreign to her, heavy in specific places, sensitive in a way that she had been putting down to stress for the past several weeks. She'd been tired in a way that her usual brand of tired, the end of a school week exhaustion, the drain of 23 kindergartners 5 days a week, didn't quite account for. She'd noticed it. She'd filed it under everything is a lot right now and moved on, because she'd been planning a wedding and managing a complicated relationship and trying not to let any of it bleed into her classroom, where 23 small people needed her whole and functional and present. She sat at the kitchen table and counted backwards. Then she put down her coffee cup and went to the pharmacy on the corner. She bought 2 tests. She bought them quickly, paid cash, walked home at a pace that was slightly faster than her usual pace, and told herself it meant nothing, that this was a precaution, that she was being thorough rather than terrified. She was thorough. She was also terrified. Both tests said the same thing. Elena sat on the cold tile of her bathroom floor and looked at the results for a long time. She was aware of a sound in her chest that wasn't quite crying, and wasn't quite not crying. A pressure, a held thing, something that wanted to break open and was being firmly managed. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. She was 29 years old. She was a kindergarten teacher in Carroll Gardens. The man who had fathered her child had said she was nothing but a mistake in front of his family and had not bothered to say otherwise. She made an appointment with her OBGYN for the following morning. She went back to work that afternoon because 23 children needed a teacher, and the world did not pause itself to accommodate her particular disaster. Dr. Vivian Park had been Elena's doctor for 3 years. She was precise and warm in equal measure, the kind of doctor who delivered information the way a good teacher delivered a difficult lesson, clearly with enough space for the student to absorb it. Elena had always appreciated that about her. She appreciated it considerably more the following morning, sitting on the examination table in a paper gown while Dr. Park moved the ultrasound wand slowly and carefully and said, after a long, deliberate pause, "Elena, I need you to look at the screen." Elena turned her head. "There are two," Dr. Park said. Elena looked at the screen, at the two small shapes, distinct and real, curled in the dark. "Twins," Dr. Park confirmed. "Approximately 8 weeks. Both measuring well." The room made a sound Elena didn't recognize for a moment, and then she understood it was the heartbeats. 2 of them. Separate and steady, like something being built in real time. "Are you all right?" Dr. Park asked. Elena looked at the screen for a long moment. "I don't know yet," she said. That was the most honest thing she'd said in 48 hours. She drove herself home. She sat in her car outside her building for 20 minutes before going inside. She climbed the stairs and unlocked her apartment and stood in the kitchen with her hands flat on the counter and understood, with a precision that felt almost pharmaceutical, that everything about her life had just permanently rearranged itself. She was not going to call Adrian. The decision arrived fully formed, the way the most important decisions sometimes did, not as a conclusion at the end of a long deliberation, but as a fact she'd somehow already known and was only now catching up to. She was not going to call Adrian Ashcroft and tell him she was carrying his children because she had heard what he said, and she had watched him say it without walking it back, and she had no evidence that the children she was carrying would be received as anything other than a complication in a negotiation she hadn't known she was part of. She was going to protect them. That was the first thing. Everything else was secondary. Over the following 2 weeks, Elena Whitlock reorganized her life with the quiet efficiency of someone who had grown up understanding that reorganization was not a crisis, but a skill. She contacted a family law attorney, a woman named Rosario Chen, who had a reputation for working with clients who needed discretion more than speed. She updated her health insurance. She began, methodically, going through her finances, understanding exactly what she had and what she would need and where the gap was. The gap was significant, not insurmountable, but significant. She did not tell her sister immediately. She told her mother first on a Sunday evening, sitting at her mother's kitchen table in Flatbush with both hands wrapped around a mug of tea. Her mother, Clara Whitlock, 57, who had raised 2 daughters on 2 jobs and never once allowed them to believe the math was impossible, listened without interrupting. When Elena finished, Clara was quiet for a long moment. "Twins run in our family," she said finally. "I know," Elena said. "Your grandmother had twins. Your aunt on your father's side had twins." "I know, Mom." "All right." Clara reached across the table and put her hand over Elena's. "All right? What do you need?" That was the conversation that actually broke Elena. Not the hallway outside the Ashcroft house, not the bathroom floor, not the ultrasound. It was her mother's hand on hers and the words, "What do you need?" offered without condition or judgment, and Elena had to press her lips together and look at the ceiling for a full minute before she could answer. What she needed was to get through the next 7 months without falling apart. She was going to need to be very specific about what falling apart meant and what it didn't, because there were 23 children at PS 130 who needed her to hold herself together with both hands 5 days a week, and she had promised herself years ago that whatever happened in her personal life stayed entirely outside that classroom door. She kept that promise. Every morning she walked into room 14, and there were 23 5-year-olds who wanted to learn to read their names and build towers and argue over who had gotten more yellow paint on the smock. And for 6 hours a day, she was entirely an uncomplicated present. It was not nothing. Some mornings it was the only thing that worked. Adrian's calls came every day for the first week. She let them go to voicemail. The voicemails were long and became increasingly raw. She could hear the composure slipping out of them as the days accumulated, the practiced control giving way to something that sounded less like a billionaire's son and more like a man who was genuinely frightened. She listened to exactly 3 of them before she stopped listening. Not because they didn't affect her, because they did. She changed her email filter. She did not block him. That felt like an action, a declaration, something he might interpret as a door left slightly open. She filed his messages into a folder she didn't open and moved on. 2 weeks became 4. She was 12 weeks along when the nausea became a manageable and mostly morning-specific event rather than a full-time condition. She began to show earlier than she'd expected. Twins, Dr. Park had explained, had a way of making themselves known. And she bought looser clothes, longer layers, and told her colleagues that she'd been struggling with a stomach issue that was resolving slowly. She wasn't ready to announce. She was still calculating what announcing meant and to whom and in what order. Her sister Danny found out on her own. Danny was 4 years older than Elena, had 2 kids of her own, and possessed a specific maternal radar that Elena had historically underestimated. She showed up at the Carroll Gardens apartment on a Saturday with coffee and a look of calm precision that told Elena the pretense stage was over. "You're pregnant," Danny said, standing in Elena's living room. Elena looked at her for a moment. 12 weeks. Twins. Danny set down the coffee. She sat on the couch. She was quiet for a long time. "Does he know?" "No." "Are you going to tell him?" "I don't know yet." Danny nodded slowly. She picked up her coffee again. She did not offer an opinion on what Elena should do, which was the most useful thing she could have done, because Elena's particular brand of stubbornness had always responded better to space than to instruction. "I'm here," Danny said. "Whatever you need." The weeks continued. Elena taught. She went to her appointments. She let her mother bring food on Sunday evenings and accepted it without argument. She slept badly and worked well and allowed herself, in the quiet spaces between, to be furious, cleanly, productively furious, at the fact that she'd been in the middle of loving someone and building something and had been disassembled without warning. The fury helped. Anger had a shape. It was easier to carry than grief, which was formless and tended to pool in low places and catch her off guard at inconvenient moments. Once in the supply closet at school when she found a painting one of her students had made for her, a lopsided family of stick figures labeled Ms. Whitlock and her babies, and had to stand in there for 4 minutes breathing deliberately before she could go back out. She was 16 weeks along when she made the first deliberate choice to step toward the question she'd been stepping around. She called Rosario Chen. "I need to understand my options," Elena said. "If the father becomes involved at some point in the future, what I'm entitled to, what he's entitled to, what the children are entitled to. I want to understand all of it before I make any decisions." Rosario Chen asked questions. Elena answered them. The conversation lasted an hour and a half and left her feeling simultaneously more informed and more tired, which was the usual effect of legal counsel at this particular stage of a situation. She was sitting at her kitchen table after the call, notes in front of her, when her phone lit up with an unknown number. She almost didn't answer. She answered because the area code was local, and she was expecting a call from a pediatrician's office she'd recently queried. "Ms. Whitlock?" The voice was a woman's. Clipped, unhurried, the specific cadence of someone accustomed to being listened to. "My name is Margaret Ashcroft. I believe we've met." Elena's hand tightened on the phone. The silence was barely a second long before Margaret continued. "I'll be direct, because I imagine directness is something you can appreciate. My son has been persistent in his attempts to locate you and make contact. I'm calling to ask, civilly, that you reconsider whatever position you've taken on that front, not for his sake. He's made his own bed with this, and the consequences are his to manage. I'm calling because there are larger matters at play, and Adrian's emotional state is currently affecting his professional judgment in ways that are costly to people beyond himself." Elena said nothing. "I understand you overheard something unpleasant," Margaret said. "I don't apologize for the substance of the conversation because the concerns expressed were valid. What I will say is that Adrian, whatever he said in that room, said it under duress. He is not a simple man. He has obligations that predate you and will outlast this situation." "Is there something you want from me?" Elena said. A pause. Brief, but present. "I want you to respond to him," Margaret said. Meet with him, say your piece, close the chapter appropriately. He will stop being useful to anyone if this continues indefinitely. Close the chapter, Elena repeated. That's what I said. Elena looked at the notepad in front of her, at the notes from her conversation with Rosario Chen, at the phrase she'd underlined twice without knowing why. Paternity, voluntary acknowledgement, establishment of rights. I'll consider it, Elena said. She ended the call. She sat for a long time. Margaret Ashcroft had called her, not to apologize, not to extend any grace or reconsideration. She had called because Adrian's grief was inconveniencing the Ashcroft machinery, and Elena was the lever she'd located. That was the entire transaction. And somewhere underneath the controlled surface of that phone call, Elena had heard something else. The specific register of a woman who was not used to things being unresolved, who found loose ends structurally threatening, who had every resource available to her and was choosing to pick up a phone and call a kindergarten teacher in Brooklyn rather than deploy them, which meant either the resources weren't available for this particular problem or she had calculated that they were. Either way, Elena had been assessed. And Margaret Ashcroft had decided she was worth a phone call. That told her something. She wasn't sure yet what it told her, but she filed it carefully beside everything else she knew, and she went to bed, and she lay there in the dark with her hands on her stomach, feeling the not yet perceptible movement of two lives she was responsible for. And she allowed herself for the first time to ask the question she'd been refusing to ask since the hallway outside the Ashcroft estate. What if she was wrong about some of it, not about the words? She'd heard the words. She'd stood close enough to stone and darkness to count the beats of silence afterward, and there had been no qualifier, no flinching, no immediate correction. But she hadn't heard everything. She'd heard a moment, a specific slice of a conversation that had its own context and history and interior architecture she'd never been shown. She'd heard a man say something terrible, and she'd made the conclusion that followed feel inevitable, because the conclusion that followed was the safest one. It required nothing of her except retreat. She lay in the dark and sat with the discomfort of that. The next morning, she went to school. She taught the letter G with a green glitter project that resulted in 3 small people covered entirely in glitter from forehead to knee, which took 20 minutes to address and was the most cheerful 20 minutes of her week. She had lunch in the teacher's lounge and listened to her colleague Marcus describe his ongoing renovation disaster and laughed at the right moments and felt, for a sustained hour, like a person whose life was primarily functional. She went home. She opened the email folder she'd been filing Adrian's messages into without reading them for the past 2 months. There were 47 emails. She started from the beginning. The first 10 were controlled. Apologetic, yes, but calibrated. The voice of someone who was still expecting a specific kind of response and had composed accordingly. By email 15, something had shifted. The language was rawer, less structured. He wasn't performing grief for her anymore. He was writing the way people write when they've stopped believing the writing will work and are doing it anyway because stopping would mean something they weren't ready for it to mean. By email 22, he was describing the dinner in terms she hadn't heard from the outside. He wrote about his mother's ultimatum in specific language, the threat she'd delivered against Elena's position at the school, against her sister's business, against the fragile, specific life Elena had built piece by piece over a decade. He wrote about Declan's involvement, the way his brother had framed the conversation, engineered the audience, created the moment for reasons that had more to do with inheritance structure than anyone's well-being. He wrote about saying the words and understanding, even as he said them, that they were going to cost him something he couldn't calculate in the moment. Elena read email 22 3 times. She read emails 23 through 29 more slowly. By email 31, Adrian was writing about the search, the actual, tangible search. The private investigator he'd hired, who had confirmed only that Elena was still in the city and employed and had not left the country. The letters he'd sent to her apartment address, registered mail, multiple times. The outreach he'd made through mutual acquaintances who had reported back nothing. She'd never received a letter. She thought about that. She thought about Margaret Ashcroft's phone call and the careful way she'd said Adrian's emotional state is currently affecting his professional judgment. The way she'd said, "I want you to respond to him," as though the failure to receive his communication had been Elena's choice rather than a fact. Elena sat at her kitchen table at 11:30 at night, 18 weeks pregnant with twins she hadn't told their father about. and felt the story she'd been living inside shift underfoot like sand. She didn't know enough yet. She needed to know more, and she was going to need to be very careful about what knowing more cost her, because she was not just herself anymore. She hadn't been just herself for 18 weeks. She closed the laptop. She put her hands on her stomach. "Okay," she said quietly, to no one, and both of them at once. "Okay, I'm thinking." She was still thinking when her phone lit up on the table beside her with a message from an unknown number, 4 words only. "I found the pen." Elena stared at the screen. Her heart did something she hadn't expected it to do. She turned the phone face down, pressed her palms flat against the table, and breathed, because the pen was at the Ashcroft estate. She'd left it on the side table by the garden entrance. She'd left it there deliberately, without explanation. A final object, an uncashed check, a thing she'd bought for a future she was walking away from. And someone had found it. She did not know yet whether that someone was the problem or the answer. What she knew, sitting alone in her kitchen at nearly midnight with 2 heartbeats she carried everywhere and 47 emails she'd finally read, was that the chapter Margaret Ashcroft had told her to close was not, in fact, closed. It had barely started. Elena did not sleep. She lay on her back in the dark with one hand on her stomach and the phone face down on the nightstand and ran the 4 words through her head until they stopped being words and became something else. A pulse, a problem, a question she couldn't answer without more information she didn't have. "I found the pen. No name, no follow-up." The message had arrived and then gone quiet the way a stone goes quiet after it hits water, and she was left with only the ripple. She got up at 5:15, made coffee she didn't taste, stood at her kitchen window and watched the street below slowly fill with the specific early morning population of Carroll Gardens. The dog walkers, the bodega deliveries, a man in a yellow jacket walking fast with his hands in his pockets and his breath coming out in clouds. The city doing what the city did, indifferent and continuous, and Elena watching it from above like a woman trying to locate herself on a map she didn't fully understand anymore. She went to school. She taught. She did not check her phone until lunch, and when she did, there was nothing new from the unknown number. Nothing from Adrian's personal number either, which had been the primary source of the unanswered calls for the past 2 months. The silence from both simultaneously had a texture to it that she didn't trust. She called Danny from the supply closet at 12:40. "Someone sent me a message last night," Elena said, without preamble. 4 words. "I found the pen. Unknown number." Danny was quiet for a moment. "The pen you left at the house?" "Yes." "Do you think it's him?" "I don't know. It doesn't read like him. He's verbose when he's trying. This was 4 words and nothing else." "Could be a trap," Danny said. "Could be a lot of things." "What do you want to do?" Elena looked at the shelf of construction paper in front of her, the labeled bins of safety scissors and dried-out markers and glitter that had migrated into everything, including, somehow, her tea thermos twice this semester. "I want to understand what I'm actually dealing with before I make another decision based on incomplete information." "That sounds like you've already decided something." "I've decided I need to respond." Danny exhaled. "Okay. Do it carefully." "I do everything carefully." "Elena." A pause. "I know you think that, but you also spent 2 months not opening 47 emails because you were afraid of what they might change." Elena didn't answer that. "Just be careful," Danny said. "With yourself, not just with him." She ended the call. She went back to her classroom. She taught the afternoon with the same deliberate attention she always brought to it, and she did not think about the message, or the pen, or the 47 emails, because she was in room 14, and room 14 was the one place in her life that she had successfully kept clean of all of it. She texted the unknown number at 6:15 that evening, sitting in her coat at her kitchen table with the overhead light on and the window dark. Who is this? Not a question mark. She'd thought about that. A question mark was an invitation. A period was a demand. The response came in 4 minutes. Thomas Vega, Adrian's assistant. "He doesn't know I'm contacting you. I need to tell you something. Can we talk?" Elena read it twice. Thomas Vega. She'd met him once, briefly, at a company event she'd attended with Adrian. 30s, quiet, the kind of efficient that didn't call attention to itself. He'd handed her a drink at the right moment and said approximately nothing all evening, which she'd interpreted as professionalism rather than anything else. She typed, "Talk now. This is talking." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. The letters he sent you, the registered mail. I watched Declan Ashcroft sign for them at the front desk of your building. 3 separate deliveries. I was there for the last one because Adrian asked me to follow up on the tracking numbers, and I drove to your building myself to confirm delivery. Declan was in the lobby when I arrived. He told the desk staff he was your cousin. He took the envelopes. Elena set the phone down on the table. She picked it up again. You're sure? I have a photo of him leaving your building, time-stamped. I've had it for 6 weeks and I didn't know what to do with it because my job is my livelihood and the Ashcrofts signed my paycheck, but I found the pen in the entryway when I was covering the house last week and I recognized it as yours and I can't keep sitting on this. Elena stood up. She didn't know she was going to stand up until she was already doing it, already pacing the length of her small kitchen, 3 steps to the window, 3 steps back. Her hands were cold. She pressed them flat against her thighs. She typed, "Send me the photo." It arrived in under a minute. The image was time-stamped, slightly grainy from a distance, but clear enough. Declan Ashcroft in the lobby of her building, a dark coat, the distinctive angle of his jaw, an envelope visible under his arm. The desk was visible in the background. The date on the timestamp was 5 weeks after she'd left the Ashcroft dinner. Elena looked at the photo for a long time. There was a feeling that arrived when something you'd decided turns out to be built on incorrect information. It wasn't quite anger, and it wasn't quite grief, and it wasn't quite anything with a clean name. It was the sensation of a floor you'd trusted turning out to be a different material than you'd assumed. Still solid, still holding, but not what you thought, and the difference mattering in ways you were only beginning to calculate. She had spent 2 months inside a story she'd constructed from one overheard sentence and one careful silence. She had built her decisions around that story. She had built her children's future around that story. She sat back down. Does Adrian know you're telling me this? No. He can't know I've been in contact with you. If Margaret or Declan find out, I lose this job. I need you to understand that I'm taking a significant risk. Why are you taking it? A longer pause this time. Because I've worked for Adrian Ashcroft for 4 years, and I've watched him look for you for 2 months, and I've watched his brother act like it's a minor inconvenience, and I know what kind of man Adrian is, and I know what kind of man Declan is, and they are not the same man. And I found your pen. Elena closed her eyes, opened them. She was 20 weeks pregnant. She was sitting alone in a Carroll Gardens kitchen at 7 in the evening with a phone in her hand and a photo of Declan Ashcroft leaving her building with her letters under his arm, and a question that had been waiting for 2 months finally arranging itself into something she could actually see. "Thank you," she typed. "Don't contact Adrian. I need to think." She put the phone down and sat very still. The thinking took 3 days. She went to school both of those days, and she was present and functional, and she read The Very Hungry Caterpillar to her class with the same warm precision she always used. And Marcus in the teacher's lounge noticed nothing. And she picked up coffee on her walk home both evenings and stood in line like a person whose life was in order. And she thought, continuously, underneath all of it. She called Rosario Chen on the 3rd evening. "I have a photograph," she said, "of a third party removing registered mail from my building. Mail addressed to me, sent by the father of my children. I need to know what this does to my legal position." Rosario was quiet for a moment. "It complicates the narrative of abandonment if that's the framework you've been operating in." "That's what I thought." "It also potentially opens a separate legal matter for the person who intercepted it. Mail theft is a federal offense." "I know." "Elena." Rosario's voice shifted slightly. "Is there something you're considering doing that you want to talk through?" "I'm considering meeting with him." "With the father?" "Yes." "Does he know about the pregnancy?" "No." "Are you planning to tell him?" Elena was quiet for a moment. Outside her window, a delivery truck was idling, the low hum of its engine traveling up through the glass. "I'm planning to see who he is when there's no script in front of him," she said. "And then I'm going to decide." She reached out to Adrian through Thomas Vega, who passed the message with clean efficiency and no elaboration. The message was simple. She would meet him, once. A public location of her choosing. she would set the time. She chose the Riverside Park Cafe on the Upper West Side, a place that had the advantage of being neither his territory nor hers, with good sightlines and enough ambient noise that a difficult conversation would have privacy without isolation. She chose a weekday afternoon, early, before the after-work crowd. She chose a corner table. She arrived at 20 minutes early, because she was Elena Whitlock, and she arrived early to everything, and she was not going to let this be the occasion where that changed. She was wearing a wool coat that was large enough to obscure. She'd made that calculation deliberately, and then felt a flicker of irritation at herself for making it. She was not hiding the pregnancy. She was managing the timing of the revelation, and those were different things, and she needed to be clear about the difference. She ordered tea. She sat with her hands around the mug and watched the door. He came in 7 minutes after the hour. He was thinner than she remembered, or maybe it was the coat, or maybe it was the look on his face when he came through the door and his eyes moved across the room and found her. A look she hadn't prepared herself for, because it wasn't relief exactly, and it wasn't contrition exactly, and it wasn't the polished, controlled expression she'd always associated with Adrian Ashcroft in public spaces. It was something rawer and less managed, the look of a man who had been running towards something for a long time and had just arrived and didn't know yet what arriving meant. He crossed the room without looking away from her. He stopped at the table. "Elena," he said. "Sit down," she said. He sat. He put his hands on the table and looked at her directly and said nothing else, which was also not what she'd expected. She'd expected an opening, apology, explanation, the structured performance of amends. Instead, he just looked at her, like he was relearning something. "You've been looking for me," she said. "Every day." "I know. I read your emails." Something moved through his face. Not surprise, exactly. More like a man who'd been braced for one kind of blow, receiving a different one. "All of them?" "All 47. He exhaled slowly through his nose. His jaw was tight. He looked like he hadn't been sleeping adequately for 2 months, which, based on the emails, he hadn't. "Then, I know what you wrote," Elena said. "That's not the same as knowing what's true. I've learned to be careful about the difference. What I wrote was true. People write true things and do false things all the time, Adrian. That's not an argument." His hands moved on the table, a small gesture, constrained. "What do you want me to say?" "Tell me what you need, and I'll say it. Tell me what I have to do." "I don't want you to perform something," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt, which was a skill she'd developed over years of managing rooms full of 5-year-olds who could smell uncertainty like weather. That's the problem with people like you. You're trained to identify what's needed and produce it. I don't know how to tell the difference between that and what's real. People like me, he repeated. People who've spent their entire lives in rooms where the right response is the most important thing in the room. He was quiet for a moment. A muscle in his jaw worked. "That's fair," he said. "It's also fair that you're sitting across from me right now instead of continuing to not respond, which I understand was your right. So something changed." "Something changed," she confirmed. "What?" She studied his face. The fatigue in it. The specific texture of grief that came from weeks of sustained uncertainty rather than a single acute loss. She'd read his emails. She knew the shape of what the last 2 months had cost him. The knowledge didn't make her inclined toward mercy, exactly. Mercy felt like the wrong category. But it clarified something. "I found out that the letters you sent, were intercepted," she said, "before they reached me, by someone in your family." The stillness that moved through Adrian Ashcroft in that moment was the kind of stillness that preceded something significant. She watched it happen. The color in his face shifted. His hands, which had been flat on the table, became fists briefly, then deliberately unclenched. "Who told you that?" His voice was quiet, which, she had learned from the emails, was the voice he used when something had moved past the point where volume was useful. "Does it matter who told me?" "Yes. Because I need to know how they know, and what they know, and whether—" He stopped, reassembled. "Declan," he said. Not a question. "I have a photograph," Elena said. He closed his eyes. 1 breath, 2, opened them. "How long have you had it?" 3 days. "And you still came today?" I came today because I'm trying to figure out whether the story I've been living in for 2 months is the actual story, she said, and I can't do that alone. I need information from you that I can't get any other way. He leaned forward slightly. Ask me anything. I will tell you the truth. I don't have anything left to protect. Your mother called me, Elena said. Adrian went very still. 3 weeks ago. She wanted me to meet with you and close the chapter. Those were her words. She wasn't asking on your behalf. She was asking because your state was affecting your usefulness. The expression that moved across his face then was not one she had a name for. It was the expression of a man being shown something he'd always known and had been hoping in some compartment he kept locked was not as bad as he knew. She didn't tell me, he said. I didn't think she did. What did you say to her? I said I'd consider it. He exhaled. It was a long sound, compressed and complicated. Elena. He stopped. Started again. The dinner. What I said. I need you to understand. I understand your explanation, she said. I read it 22 times in your emails. Understanding an explanation isn't the same as believing it. No, she agreed. It's not. They looked at each other across the table. The cafe made its ambient sounds around them. The espresso machine, a low conversation 2 tables away, rain beginning to tap against the window in the particular light way it rained in October in New York, when it was more texture than event. What do you need from me? He asked. And this time it was not the performance she'd anticipated. It was quieter than that, and more tired. And it didn't have the shape of a man producing the correct response. It had the shape of a man who had run out of strategies and was left with only the question. Elena looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the photo on her phone, the 47 emails, the 4 words from Thomas Vega, her mother's hand on hers, the sound, 2 months ago in a doctor's office, of 2 heartbeats she'd been carrying alone. I need you to be honest with me about your family, she said. Not the version that protects you. Not the version that makes the explanation tidy. The actual thing. What your mother is capable of. What Declan is capable of. What you've been willing to tolerate and for how long. Something shifted in his face. A kind of weight landing. That's going to take more than one conversation, he said. I know. Are you saying you're willing to have more than one? She didn't answer immediately. She picked up her tea, found it had gone cold, set it back down. She looked out the window at the rain making the sidewalk dark, and the people moving under it with their collars up, and she thought about the very specific courage it took to walk back toward something that had already hurt you, with more at stake than you'd had the first time. I'm saying I'm here today, she said, and I came because I decided the truth was worth more to me than the certainty of the version I already had. Adrian studied her face. Whatever he saw there made him nod, once, slowly. Okay, he said. Okay, then I'll start from the beginning, and I won't make it tidy. He started talking. He talked for 1 hour and 20 minutes, and Elena listened with the specific quality of attention she brought to things that mattered. Not passive, not waiting for her turn, but genuinely present, tracking the weight distribution of every sentence, the places where he chose a word carefully, and the places where he didn't, the moments where his voice changed register in a way that wasn't performance. He talked about his mother's relationship with the Hargrove family and the 17-year history of a business agreement that had been built on the assumption that Adrian would eventually be delivered as a kind of human collateral. He talked about Declan's position in the family, not the younger son, as Elena had vaguely understood it, but a man whose entire identity had been shaped by resentment of Adrian's position, whose cooperation with Margaret was strategic rather than familial. He talked about the dinner, and he did not make it tidy. He said he had been afraid, and that fear had made him cruel in the specific way that fear made people cruel, quickly, in a direction they thought would protect something, without accounting for what they were destroying. Elena listened to all of it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Why didn't you tell me any of this before, she said. About the Hargrove agreement? About what your mother was asking for? He looked at his hands. Because I thought I could manage it without... He stopped. Because I didn't want you to see the shape of the thing I came from. And I thought protecting you from it was the same as protecting you. And it isn't. He looked up. I know it isn't. I knew it the night of the dinner. I've known it every day since. You made a decision for me, she said, without asking. Yes. That's not protection. That's control. Yes, he said again. No qualifier. No explanation offered, just the acknowledgement, flat and complete. She looked at him for a long moment. I need to go, she said. He stood when she stood. He didn't reach for her, which was the right decision. She pulled on her coat and gathered her bag and walked toward the door, and she was almost there when she stopped, her back still to him, and said over her shoulder, I'm going to think about what you told me. Take whatever time you need. Adrian, she turned halfway. If I find out that anything you said today was constructed to produce a specific result, any part of it, I will not have another conversation with you. Not one. His face was open and tired and without its usual architecture. I know, he said. She nodded once and walked out into the rain. She didn't take a car. She walked 14 blocks in the October rain with her collar up and her hands in her pockets and her mind working at a low continuous hum. And she didn't try to reach a conclusion because conclusions required more data than she currently had. And she knew the difference between processing and deciding, and she was still firmly in the first category. She was 8 blocks from the subway when her phone buzzed. A message from Thomas Vega. Declan knows I've been in contact with you. I don't know how. You need to know that. Elena stopped walking. The rain came down. She stood on the sidewalk and understood, with a cold and immediate clarity, that the careful perimeter she'd built around her life, the silence, the distance, the 2 months of precise and solitary management, had just developed a breach she hadn't chosen and couldn't control. Declan Ashcroft knew she was no longer invisible, and she was 20 weeks pregnant with his brother's twins, standing alone in the rain on the Upper West Side, with a story that was no longer hers to contain. She stood on the sidewalk for 30 seconds that felt considerably longer, rain coming down at a steady angle, and made herself think rather than react. Declan knew. That was the fact. The question underneath the fact was how he'd found out, which thread he'd pulled, whether Thomas Vega had been visible somehow or whether there was a different breach entirely. The second question was what he intended to do with the information. And the third question, the one that arrived cold and specific in the back of her chest, was whether he knew about the pregnancy. She started walking again. Fast, deliberate. The way she moved when something required action and standing still was no longer acceptable. She called Danny from the subway platform, pressed into the corner away from the other waiting passengers, her voice low. Declan Ashcroft knows I met with Adrian today, she said. A beat of silence. How? I don't know yet. I need to think about where I'm sleeping tonight. Here, Danny said, without pause. Come here. I don't want to bring this to your door. Elena. Danny's voice was flat and certain. You are 20 weeks pregnant and you are alone and you are not sleeping in that apartment by yourself tonight. Come here. Elena closed her eyes briefly. The train came in on a wave of displaced air. I'll be there in 40 minutes. She sat on the train with her coat pulled close and her bag on her lap and worked through what she knew. Declan had intercepted her letters. He'd done it in person, which meant he'd been paying attention to Adrian's movements closely enough to know that registered mail was being sent, and to which address. He had positioned himself as a resource to eliminate, not through threat, but through absence, through the manufactured silence of a woman who had simply never written back, never responded, never given Adrian any reason to believe the door was open. That was elegant, in the way cruelty sometimes was when it was patient enough. You didn't need to break anything. You just removed the connections one at a time until the person was isolated and the isolation looked like choice. Now that architecture had a crack in it. She got off 2 stops early and walked the rest of the way to Danny's house in Park Slope, covering the last 6 blocks at a pace that was more purposeful than necessary and less calm than she would have liked. Danny's husband, Ray, opened the door, took one look at her, and said, I'll make food, and disappeared into the kitchen. He was a quiet man who had learned over 11 years of marriage to Danny Whitlock that the most useful response to a crisis was usually practical and immediate. Elena had always appreciated him enormously for that. Danny was at the kitchen table with tea already poured and a look on her face that was not panic but was adjacent to it. Controlled concern, the face of a woman making herself stay level because someone in the room needed her to. Elena sat down. She took off her wet coat and hung it over the chair and looked at her sister. Tell me everything, Danny said. Elena told her. The cafe, the conversation, Adrian's account of his mother and Declan, and the Hargrove agreement, the hour and 20 minutes, and what she had and hadn't decided. Thomas Vega's message on the sidewalk outside. Danny listened without interrupting, which was not her default, but which she deployed when the situation required it. When Elena finished, Danny wrapped both hands around her mug and said, "What does Declan actually want?" "I don't know," Elena said. "The intercept suggests he wants me gone, or specifically wants Adrian's attention off of me, whether that's about the business arrangement or whether it's something else." "The inheritance," Danny said. Elena looked at her. "Adrian is the firstborn. Everything defaults to him. If Adrian marries you, a kindergarten teacher from Brooklyn with no family money and no corporate connections, the family line goes in a direction Declan can't control." Danny set her mug down. "But if Adrian stays unattached, or if the arrangement with Hargrove goes through, Declan benefits," Elena said. "Does Adrian know that?" "He knows his brother resents him. Whether he understands the full shape of it," she shook her head. "He spoke about Declan like a man who understood he had an enemy, but hadn't entirely accepted that the enemy was actively working against him. There's a difference." Danny was quiet for a moment. Ray set a plate of food in front of Elena without comment, and Elena ate without tasting it because her body needed fuel regardless of what her mind was doing. "What are you going to do?" Danny said. "I'm going to call Rosario in the morning," Elena said, "and I'm going to figure out what legal protection I have and what I don't, and then I'm going to make a decision about the pregnancy." Danny's expression shifted. "About telling him?" "Yes." "What did you decide today?" "About him?" Elena looked at the table. She thought about Adrian across from her, the fatigue in his face, the way he'd said "I know" when she told him she'd leave without warning, not as a performance, but as an acknowledgement that she had the right. She thought about the 47 emails and the specific quality of their deterioration. She thought about what it cost a person to tell the truth in a way that didn't make themselves the hero of it. "I decided he's not who I thought he was the night of the dinner," she said. "I don't know yet if that's enough." She slept in Danny's guest room, which smelled like the cedar chest Danny kept blankets in, and the particular brand of calm that came from being in a house where someone else was responsible for the locks. She slept better than she had in weeks. She hated that she slept better because it told her something about the specific weight of 2 months of solitary management that she hadn't been ready to admit. She woke at 6. She lay still for a moment with her hands on her stomach, the small but real weight of it against her palms, and she thought about the 2 heartbeats she'd heard in Dr. Park's office and the way they'd sounded like something being built in real time. And she said quietly and without expecting an answer, "I'm working on it." Her phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar. Not Thomas Vega's number. Different. She answered, "Ms. Whitlock." The voice was male, smooth, carrying the specific warmth of someone who had learned to deploy charm as a professional instrument. "My name is Declan Ashcroft. I believe we have some things to discuss." Elena's body went very still. She sat up slowly, feet on the floor, and breathed. "How did you get this number?" she said. "The same way I get most things," Declan said. "Attention and patience. 2 qualities I have in considerable supply." "What do you want?" "To be direct with you, I understand you met with my brother yesterday. I understand you've been in contact with Thomas Vega, who is apparently suffering from a misplaced sense of loyalty." A pause. Brief. Calibrated. "I also understand you're expecting." The floor beneath Elena's feet became a different surface entirely. "I don't know what you think you know," she said. Her voice was level. She made it level with both hands, the way you held a door shut against wind. "I know what the medical records suggest," Declan said, "which is to say I know enough. My mother's attorney has significant resources, and your OBGYN's office was not as secure as you might have hoped." Her records. Someone had accessed her medical records. The illegality of that was immediate and vast, but the illegality was not her first thought. Her first thought was simpler and more primitive. They know. "What do you want?" she said again, and this time it wasn't a question. "I want the same thing I've always wanted," Declan said, "which is for the situation to resolve in a way that doesn't create complications. My brother's life is complicated enough. Adding a paternity claim to the Hargrove negotiation table creates a problem for a lot of people." "It's not a paternity claim," Elena said. They're his children. Those are words that sound different depending on who's saying them and in what context and in front of which judge. His voice was still smooth, still carrying that practiced warmth, and underneath it, something cold and structural, the voice of someone who had spent enough time around lawyers to have absorbed their architecture. I'm not threatening you, Ms. Whitlock. I'm presenting the situation clearly. Adrian is about to finalize an agreement that has significant implications for this family. The timing of a pregnancy announcement, particularly one involving twins, would be read as strategic regardless of whether it is. The press alone would be, Declan. She said his name the way you said something you wanted to stop moving. Stop. A pause. You broke federal law, she said. Intercepting registered mail is a federal offense. Accessing my medical records without consent is a violation of federal privacy law. Those aren't words that sound different depending on context. Those are facts. Silence. Then, Thomas Vega told you about the mail. I have a photograph. The quality of the silence changed. I see, Declan said. I want you to hear me clearly, Elena said. She was standing now. She didn't know when she'd stood up. She was standing at the window of Danny's guest room with the morning light gray outside and her hand tight on the phone. I have not made any decisions about what I do with what I know. But if I find out you've gone anywhere near my medical information again, or near my sister, or near anyone connected to me, I will go directly to a federal attorney and I will bring Thomas Vega's photograph and every email your brother sent that I've documented, and I will make a very clear case that the communication between your family and mine has not been voluntary on my end. Am I clear? A long pause, longer than the others. You're more prepared than I expected, Declan said. Most people underestimate me, Elena said. It's a pattern I've stopped finding surprising. The call ended. She stood at the window with the phone at her side and took 3 slow breaths, and then her hand started shaking, which was the body's accounting system presenting the bill for the last 4 minutes. She sat on the edge of the bed and let her hands shake until they stopped, and then she got up and went downstairs. Danny was in the kitchen. She looked at Elena's face and said, "What happened?" Elena told her. Danny sat down in a chair when Elena got to the part about the medical records. She sat down with the specific weight of a person receiving information that changes the scale of what they're dealing with. Ray, who had been pouring coffee, set the pot down very carefully and did not say anything. He accessed your records, Danny said, or Margaret's attorney did, which for legal purposes amounts to the same thing. That's a significant violation. Yes, Rosario Chen is going to hear about this in approximately 45 minutes. Elena accepted the coffee Ray put in front of her. The question is what they're planning to do with the information. He framed it as a warning. The implication was that if I announce the pregnancy publicly at this juncture, they'll attempt to make it look strategic, a paternity play against the Hargrove deal. Can they do that? They can try to characterize it that way publicly. Whether it holds up legally is a different question, but public characterization doesn't need to hold up legally to do damage. She wrapped both hands around the mug. The point isn't whether they'd win. The point is the fight itself, the cost of it. Danny looked at her with an expression that was careful and direct and wholly sisterly. So what do you do? I tell Adrian, Elena said, today, before Declan does it for me. The silence in the kitchen had a shape to it. Danny and Ray exchanged a look, not the conspiratorial kind, but the kind between people who have lived together long enough that a glance carries a full sentence. You were going to tell him anyway, Danny said. I was deciding. And now you've decided. I've had the decision made for me, Elena said, which is different. I wanted to tell him when I was ready, on my terms, with enough information to know what I was walking into. She set the mug down. Now, someone else has the information, and waiting doesn't protect me anymore. Waiting only means Declan controls the timing instead of me. Do you trust Adrian? Danny asked. The question sat on the table between them. Elena thought about the cafe, about the hour and 20 minutes, about the way he'd said, I know, when she named what he'd done. Not as deflection, not as a pivot toward forgiveness-seeking, but as a simple acknowledgement that she was right and he had no counterargument. She thought about the emails, and the private investigator, and the registered letters sitting in Declan Ashcroft's possession for 5 weeks while Adrian sent more. I trust that he wants to fix it, she said. I don't know yet if wanting is enough. Is it enough to tell him? She thought about the 2 heartbeats, the handwritten note on the ultrasound, the sunrise through Danny's guest room window. 2 lives that were going to arrive in approximately 4.5 months and needed more of a future than a carefully managed secret could provide. It's enough to stop letting someone else decide what he gets to know, she said. She called Thomas Vega first. Declan called me this morning, she said when he picked up. He knows you were in contact with me. A sharp intake of breath. I don't know how he... It doesn't matter right now. I need you to do something. I need you to get Adrian somewhere private in the next 2 hours and tell him I need to see him. Don't tell him why. Just tell him it's important and it can't wait. Miss Whitlock. Thomas's voice was careful. If Declan is moving, then I need to move faster, Elena said. Can you do this? A pause. Yes. Thank you. And Thomas, whatever happens after today, what you did matters. I want you to know that. He didn't respond to that, but she heard something shift in his breathing before he said, I'll call you with the location. She borrowed dry clothes from Danny, a sweater, dark trousers, flat boots, and stood in front of the mirror in the guest bathroom for a moment. The wool sweater was loose and long, and the pregnancy was visible if you knew to look, and she looked, and she decided it was accurate, which was all it needed to be. She took the ultrasound image from her wallet, where she'd been carrying it since her 20-week appointment, folded once along a crease worn soft from handling. She held it for a moment. 2 shapes, distinct and real, the handwritten annotation in Dr. Park's careful script. Twin A, Twin B. Both measuring well at 20 weeks. She put it in the inner pocket of her coat, against her chest. Thomas called at 9:40 with an address. A private meeting room at a financial firm on the 43rd floor of a building on 6th Avenue where Adrian kept a standing arrangement for client confidentiality. Clean, neutral, documented. She arrived at 10:15. Adrian was already there. He stood when she came in, the same instinct he'd had at the cafe, and he read her face the way he'd been learning to read it, not with the practiced social attention of someone managing an impression, but with the particular focus of a man who understood that what was about to happen was significant, and that his job right now was to receive it. She sat down across from him at the small conference table. She reached into her coat pocket. She put the ultrasound image on the table between them, face up, and slid it toward him without a word. He looked at it. He picked it up. He held it with both hands and studied it, and she watched his face go through several things in rapid succession. Confusion, then comprehension, then something that broke across his features like a physical event, a complete structural failure of every wall the Ashcroft family had spent 40 years building in him. He looked up at her. Elena, he said, and his voice had lost every layer but one. 20 weeks, she said. Twins, both healthy. I found out the morning after the dinner. His hands were not steady. She could see them, the way the image trembled slightly between his fingers, and he looked back down at it, at the 2 small shapes and the handwritten notation, and the sound he made was not a word. It was something underneath words, something that arrived before language. You've been... He couldn't finish the sentence. Alone, she said. Yes. He set the image down very carefully on the table, like it was something that required handling, and he pressed both hands flat against the surface and looked at it. And Elena watched the man across from her come apart in a way she hadn't seen a person come apart before. Not with noise or collapse, but with the specific quiet devastation of someone who had been missing something vast without knowing the full shape of what was missing, and was now seeing the shape for the first time. I need to tell you something, she said. Declan called me this morning. He knows about the pregnancy. Someone accessed my medical records, and I need you to understand what that means and what he implied and what I believe he's prepared to do. Adrian looked up from the image. His face had changed. The devastation was still there, but something else had arrived alongside it. A cold, focused quality, the kind of clarity that came when something personal became something that required a response rather than just a feeling. Tell me everything he said, Adrian said, and his voice was very quiet, which she now knew was the voice he used when something had moved past the point where any other register was useful, and she understood. Looking at him across that table with the ultrasound image between them, and 4.5 months of carefully managed silence finally broken open, that whatever came next was going to require both of them in ways neither of them had been prepared for, and that the version of this story where she handled it alone had ended the moment Declan Ashcroft picked up the phone. She told him everything. She laid it out the way Rosario Chen had taught her to lay out information, chronologically, specifically without editorializing, because editorializing created gaps that other people's arguments could fill. Declan's call that morning, the implication about the medical records, the framing he'd used, strategic, timing, paternity claim, the deliberate vocabulary of someone who had already consulted attorneys about how to characterize a situation before the situation became public. She told Adrian about the registered mail, not because it was new information to either of them now, but because she needed him to hold the full picture in sequence, to understand that this wasn't a single hostile act, but a sustained and deliberate campaign with a specific architecture. Adrian listened without moving. He sat with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on her face, and he did not interrupt once, which she recognized as the discipline of a man who had learned that reacting before you had the complete information was expensive. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "The medical records," he said. "You're certain?" He had specific information he couldn't have gotten any other way. Either he accessed them directly, or someone did it on his behalf. Either way, someone broke federal law. "My mother's attorney." He said it without inflection, a statement of fact arriving in a place that was past surprise. "James Rourke. He's done it before. Different context, same method. You know about this." "I know what Rourke is capable of. I've never had direct evidence." He looked at the ultrasound image still on the table. "I have a daughter. No, 2. He stopped, reorganized. "My children's mother has had her private medical records accessed without consent. That's evidence." "Adrian?" She leaned forward slightly. "I need you to hear me on something. I am not doing this through your family's legal structure. I have my own attorney. What happens next happens through her, not through whoever the Ashcrofts retain." He met her eyes. "I understand. I mean it. If you bring Ashcroft resources into this without consulting me first—" "Elena." His voice was quiet and direct. "I heard you. Your call, your attorney, your timing. I am not here to take this over. I gave up the right to make unilateral decisions about your life the night of that dinner, and I know that." She studied his face for a moment. Then she nodded. "Rosario Chen," she said. "I'm calling her now." She called Rosario from the conference room with Adrian present, which was a decision she made in real time and filed away to examine later. The fact that she'd made it, what it meant about where she'd landed on the question of him. Rosario picked up on the second ring and listened to the condensed version with the focused silence of someone running calculations in real time. Medical record access without consent is a HIPAA violation at minimum and potentially criminal under federal statutes depending on method of access, Rosario said. Combined with the mail interception, you have 2 separate federal matters. The question is whether you want to pursue them as leverage or as prosecution. "Explain the difference," Elena said. "Leverage means you use the existence of the evidence to control Declan's behavior going forward. You communicate through appropriate channels, that you have documentation and the capacity to act on it, and you allow that fact to function as a deterrent. Prosecution means you file, you go on record, you accept the public dimension of a legal proceeding. What does prosecution cost me? Time. Exposure. Your pregnancy becomes part of a public record. The press attention that Declan threatened to weaponize becomes a certainty rather than a risk." A brief pause. "What does leverage cost you?" "Nothing permanent," Elena said, "unless he calls the bluff." "Is he the kind of person who calls bluffs?" Elena looked at Adrian across the table. He was listening, reading the half of the conversation he could hear with the focused attention of a man who was being very careful to be useful rather than directive. "He's the kind of person who believes other people's limits are negotiable," she said. "So probably yes, eventually." "Then leverage is a delay, not a resolution," Rosario said. "I'd recommend preparing both tracks simultaneously. Move forward as though you intend to file, because that preparation is the only thing that makes the leverage credible. I'll start pulling together the documentation this afternoon. I need you in my office tomorrow morning." "I'll be there." She ended the call. Adrian was looking at the ultrasound image again, quietly, with an expression she didn't have language for yet. "What do you need from me right now?" he said. Nothing right now. Tomorrow, I need you to get Thomas Vega to a safe position. If Declan knows Thomas was in contact with me, Thomas is exposed, and his testimony about the mail interception is one of our strongest pieces of evidence. Done. No hesitation. I'll handle it tonight. Without telling Declan you're doing it, obviously. She stood. She picked up the ultrasound image from the table and held it for a moment, and then, without fully planning to, she set it back down in front of him. Keep it, she said. I have others. He looked at her. She could see what the gesture cost him to receive, the specific weight of being given something after a long period of having nothing. He picked it up carefully. Elena. He stood. I need to say something. Adrian, one thing, then I'll stop. He held the image and looked at her. I know what I did. I know what it cost. I'm not going to stand in front of you and recite a list of intentions because you've heard enough of those from me and they don't function as currency anymore. What I can tell you is that whatever this requires, legally, financially, logistically, personally, I will meet it. Not because I'm trying to buy my way back into a position, because those are my children, and you are the person carrying them, and I am not going to be absent from either fact. She looked at him for a long moment. Show me, she said. Don't tell me. She left him with the image and went to meet Danny. The next 48 hours moved at the speed of a thing that had been held in place for too long and was now releasing all at once. Rosario Chen's office. Documents. Thomas Vega relocated to a sublease arrangement in Midtown that Adrian funded without being asked twice. A letter drafted by Rosario, precise and cold and legally immaculate, sent to James Works' firm citing the specific federal statutes violated and the specific evidence in Elena's possession, and noting that a decision on whether to file had not yet been finalized. The subtext of the letter was clean. We have everything we need and we are choosing, at this moment, not to use it. That choice is contingent on behavior going forward. Work's response arrived in less than 4 hours, which told Elena that Declan had read the room and understood that the ground had shifted. The response was not an admission, it was an offer. Rosario brought it to Elena on the third morning, sitting across from her in the Carroll Gardens apartment with her briefcase open and her reading glasses on and her expression the careful neutral of a professional who had opinions she was holding in reserve until asked. They want to negotiate, Rosario said. The offer on the table is financial, a structured settlement, significant, in exchange for a mutual non-disclosure agreement and a paternity arrangement that keeps the matter private. Elena looked at the number on the paper Rosario slid across. They want me to take money and disappear, Elena said. That's the plain language of it, yes. What happens if I refuse? They go to the press first. Preemptive framing, paternity claim against the Hargrove deal, time to create maximum damage. Rosario removed her glasses, which was always the threat. They're just making it explicit now. Elena sat with that for a moment. She thought about the number on the paper, about what it represented. Not security, but the price someone had put on her silence. The specific calculation of what they believed she was worth paying off. She thought about her mother's hands on the kitchen table, about 23 children in room 14, about the weight she'd been carrying alone for 22 weeks, the pre-dawn hours and the supply closet, and the deliberate management of a life that refused to look like what it was. No, she said. Rosario nodded once. She had the look of someone who had expected that answer. Then we file. We file, Elena confirmed. Both matters. Mail interception, medical record access. I want it on record before they get to the press, so that whatever they say about timing and strategy, there's already a federal complaint with a timestamp that predates it. That makes your pregnancy public. My pregnancy is already public to anyone Declan has talked to. The question is whether I control the narrative or he does. She looked at Rosario steadily. File tomorrow. Rosario filed the next morning. By noon it had leaked. Elena had expected that. Federal complaints weren't sealed, and someone in someone's orbit would move the information quickly once it was accessible. What she hadn't entirely calculated was the speed of it, the way it arrived not as a slow accumulation of coverage, but as a single wave, the specific momentum of a story that had 2 billionaire-adjacent names attached to it, and a pregnancy and an allegation of federal law violations. Her phone started going off before she got back from Rosario's office. She turned it face down and drove to her mother's house in Flatbush and sat at the kitchen table, and Clara Whitlock made tea and didn't look at her phone and said, "Whatever happens today, you did the right thing." "I don't know that yet," Elena said. "I do," her mother said. And that was the end of the conversation on that subject. Adrian called at 2 in the afternoon. She answered. "Declan has retained separate counsel," he said. His voice was controlled and tight. "He's attempting to reframe the complaint as retaliatory. That's going to be his public line." "Let him," Elena said. "The timestamps are what they are. My mother has made a statement to the press. I haven't seen it yet." "What does your attorney say?" "That she's characterized the situation as a private family matter being exploited by an outside party during a sensitive business negotiation." A pause. "Elena, I'm sorry. This is—" "Adrian," she cut him off. "Don't apologize for things your family does. Manage them." A short silence. "What do you need me to do?" "I need you to make a statement of your own," she said, "not through a lawyer. Your name, your words. Acknowledging the pregnancy, acknowledging the children as yours, and making clear you are cooperating fully with the federal complaint." He was quiet. "That burns the Hargrove deal," he said. "I know. That's... my mother will..." "Adrian," her voice was steady and direct. "I need to know whether you're in this or not. That's the only question that's in front of you right now." Silence. 4 seconds. 5. "Send me your attorney's contact," he said. "I'll have my statement to you by end of day." He sent it at 6:47 that evening. She read it twice. It was direct and unambiguous, and written in language that was recognizably his own. Not the polished output of a communications team, but something closer to what the emails had sounded like. Rawer than his public register, and more specific. He acknowledged the pregnancy. He confirmed cooperation with the federal matter. He stated plainly that certain members of his family had acted without his knowledge or consent in ways that had caused direct harm, and that he took responsibility for the circumstances that had created the conditions for that harm, even where the specific actions were not his. It was, she thought, the most honest public statement she had ever read from someone whose family employed a communications team specifically to prevent honest public statements. She called him. He picked up. "It's good," she said. "Is it enough?" She didn't answer that question because it wasn't the right question yet. What she said was, "It's true. That's what matters right now." He released it the next morning. The reaction was not calm. Margaret Ashcroft appeared at Rosario Chen's office at 9:45 the following morning, unannounced, with James Rourke at her shoulder and the specific posture of a woman who had spent 60 years understanding that her physical presence in a room was a form of argument. Rosario's assistant called Elena from the lobby while Margaret was still waiting, and Elena, sitting in Danny's car 2 blocks away because she'd had an appointment with Rosario at 10, made a decision in approximately 3 seconds. "I'm coming in," she told the assistant. Danny put a hand on her arm. "Elena." "She came to my attorney's office," Elena said. "She came here to see what I look like when I'm managed. I'm not letting her set that frame." She got out of the car. She took the elevator to the 14th floor and walked into Rosario's waiting room and stopped in front of Margaret Ashcroft, who was seated in the chair nearest the window with her coat on and her hands in her lap and the expression of a woman who was very rarely surprised. Margaret looked at her. Then her eyes moved with deliberate and calculated subtlety to Elena's midsection. "Ms. Whitlock," she said. "Mrs. Ashcroft," Elena said. "I'd like to speak with you privately." "You're in my attorney's office," Elena said. "Anything you say to me happens with her present." A beat. "Fine." Margaret stood. She was a tall woman, not quite Elena's height, but carrying herself in a way that added inches. "I'm going to offer you something more substantial than what James put in that letter. I'm going to offer you something that solves the problem cleanly and allows everyone involved to move forward." "I already answered that letter," Elena said. "You answered a number," Margaret said. "I'm offering something different. I'm offering quiet. The press goes away. The Hargrove matter becomes irrelevant. The federal complaint becomes unnecessary because the situation it was filed to address no longer exists." She paused. I'm asking you to understand that there are ways to resolve this that don't require public war, and that a public war has casualties on both sides. Including my children, Elena said. Your children would be provided for, comprehensively. They will be provided for, Elena said, by their father, who made a public statement yesterday acknowledging them, which you saw. Something moved in Margaret's face. It was brief and tightly controlled, but it was there. The expression of a woman whose architecture had taken damage and was assessing the structural implications. Adrian made that statement under duress, Margaret said. He made it because it's true, Elena said, and he made it because he decided for once that the truth was worth more than the arrangement. She looked at Margaret Ashcroft with the steady, quiet attention she'd spent 4 years developing in a room full of 5-year-olds who needed someone to hold the line without flinching. I know what you're capable of. I know what James Rourke is capable of. I know what Declan has done and what you've allowed and what you've directed. And so does my attorney, and so does a federal investigator who received our complaint 48 hours ago. So when you come into this office and tell me you're offering quiet, I need you to understand that I am not afraid of the noise. The room was still. Rosario Chen was standing in the doorway to the inner office, and she said nothing because there was nothing to add. Margaret looked at Elena for a long moment. The calculation behind her eyes was visible, which was unusual. Elena had never seen Margaret Ashcroft let calculation show before. It meant something. It meant the variables were no longer tracking the way she'd built them to track. You're making a mistake, Margaret said. I've made mistakes, Elena said. I know what they feel like. This isn't one of them. Margaret Ashcroft picked up her bag. She looked at James Rourke, who had said nothing since they'd entered the room, and the look between them carried something that was not defeat exactly, but was close enough that the difference no longer mattered. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame and said, without turning around, My son is not who you think he is. I know, Elena said. He's better. The door closed. Elena stood in the middle of Rosario's waiting room and felt her legs, which had been steady for the last 9 minutes, remind her that they were tired. She sat down in the nearest chair. Rosario came in with water, set it on the table, sat across from her. That was, Rosario started. Don't, Elena said. Not yet. She drank the water. She put her hand on her stomach. She breathed. Her phone lit up. Adrian. She answered. My mother just left Rourke's office, Adrian said. He told her the federal investigation has been formally opened, not just the complaint, an actual investigation. The mail interception triggered a secondary review of Rourke's firm's communications practices going back 18 months. His voice was tight and fast, the cadence of a man moving through information as it arrived. Declan is being asked to make himself available for questioning. When? They want him in within 48 hours. Elena closed her eyes, opened them. Elena. Adrian's voice shifted, dropped into the quieter register. It's moving faster than either of us anticipated. I need you to be somewhere safe while this plays out. Not because I think you're in danger, but because when Declan is backed into a corner, he's not predictable, and I am not willing to. I'm at Rosario's office, she said. I'm fine. After I'll go to Danny's. Okay. A breath. Okay. I'm going to go talk to my brother. She sat up. Adrian, not to warn him. To tell him it's over. A pause. He needs to hear it from me. That's how this ends. She wanted to say something about the risk of that. About what Declan was capable of in a corner. About the 48 hours between now and his questioning and what a person like Declan might do with 48 hours. She wanted to tell him to be careful, and the wanting of that surprised her, the specific quality of it. Not strategic concern, but something more immediate, more personal, the particular fear that came from having something to lose. Be careful, she said. I will. Adrian. She pressed her hand flat against her stomach. 2 heartbeats she was carrying into a future that was assembling itself faster than anyone had planned. Whatever happens in that conversation, come back. The line was quiet for a moment. I will, he said again, and this time it wasn't just an answer to her words, but to something underneath them, and she knew he knew it the moment Declan opened the door. The apartment was on the 31st floor of a building in Tribeca that Declan had purchased 3 years ago with money that was technically his own and practically the family's. The way most things Declan owned existed in that particular gray space between independence and subsistence. Adrian had been here twice before. Both times for occasions Declan had engineered to look casual. A drink, a conversation, the performance of brothers who got along well enough. Adrian had always known the performance for what it was. He had simply chosen, for most of his adult life, to participate in it rather than examine it. Because examination had costs he hadn't been ready to pay. He was ready now. Declan answered the door in a dress shirt with the sleeves pushed up, a glass of something amber in his hand, and the expression of a man who had been expecting this visit and had prepared a version of himself to receive it. The expression was careful and faintly amused, which was Declan's default architecture when he was managing a situation he didn't yet know the full dimensions of. "Adrian," he said. He stepped back from the door without being asked. "You look terrible." "I know," Adrian said. He came inside. The apartment was the kind of space that communicated its inhabitants' priorities without requiring inspection. Clean, expensive, deliberately curated, and absent of anything that might be characterized as warm. No photographs. No objects that appeared to have been kept for sentimental, rather than aesthetic reasons. A city view through floor-to-ceiling glass that was spectacular and impersonal, the way a screensaver was spectacular and impersonal. Adrian stood in the center of the living room and did not sit down, because sitting down was a concession to the idea that this was a conversation that required comfort, and it wasn't. "The federal investigation is open," Adrian said. Declan took a sip from his glass. "I'm aware." James called. "They want you for questioning in 48 hours. Also aware." "Then you know what this means." Declan set the glass down on the kitchen island and looked at his brother with the specific expression he'd been using on Adrian since they were children. The look that said, "You are always slightly behind me in your understanding of the situation, and I have the patience to wait for you to catch up." "It means someone in Elena Whitlock's camp has retained aggressive counsel and has been building a case for longer than I gave them credit for." He said Elena's name the way you said the name of a variable in an equation, relevant but not weighted. "It means the federal complaint has teeth. It doesn't mean I'm finished." "You accessed her medical records," Adrian said. "James's firm accessed certain documents in the course of routine due diligence." "Stop!" Adrian's voice didn't rise. It did the other thing, went down, went flat, went to the register he used when he had stopped moving toward something and had arrived. "Don't do that. Don't use that language with me. I'm not a deposition. I'm your brother." Declan looked at him for a moment. Something shifted briefly in his expression. Not remorse, not exactly, but something that recognized a shift in the topology of the conversation. "Fine," Declan said. "James's people accessed her medical records. I was informed of the pregnancy. I made a judgment call about what that information meant for the family's position." "What it meant for your position," Adrian said. "The family's position is my position. That's always been true. You know that. I know you've spent 20 years deciding that whatever benefits you is by definition what benefits the family," Adrian said. "I know you told yourself that so many times it stopped sounding like a choice and started sounding like a fact." He looked at his brother across the clean, expensive, impersonal space between them. "You intercepted my letters. You went to her building yourself. That wasn't a judgment call about the family. That was about me." Declan picked up his glass again. His jaw was tight, but the tightness was contained, managed. "You were going to marry her." "Yes." "She's—" "Don't say unsuitable," Adrian said. "I'm asking you not to say that word. A beat." Declan didn't say it. He turned toward the window instead, looking out at the city, and for a moment he was just a man with a glass of whiskey looking at a view, and Adrian could see, underneath the architecture of everything Declan had constructed around himself, the outline of something smaller and older and more frightened. He'd always been able to see it. He'd chosen, for most of their lives, to treat it as context rather than cause, an explanation without an excuse. "What did you think was going to happen," Adrian said, "when you took the letters? When you had her records pulled, what was the end of that plan?" Declan looked at the window for a moment before answering. "I thought she'd disappear," he said. "I thought she'd move on. I thought you'd get through the Hargrove arrangement, and in 2 years, it would have been, what? A mistake I recovered from? Something you got past. She's carrying my children, Declan. The words landed in the room with a weight that Declan couldn't manage, couldn't redirect, couldn't contain. Adrian watched his brother absorb them. Not the information, because he already had the information, but the specific reality of what they meant in Adrian's mouth, rather than in a document or a phone call. The irreducibility of it. I know, Declan said, quieter than before. You tried to make sure I never knew, Adrian said. You took my letters out of her hands. You had her medical records pulled and used them to threaten her. You did all of this while I was spending 2 months looking for her, and you watched me and you said nothing. Declan turned from the window. His face had shed the careful amusement. What was underneath it was harder to categorize. Not guilt, not quite, but the specific exhaustion of a person whose strategies have failed and who is left standing in the room with the consequences. I did what I thought was necessary, he said. I know you believe that, Adrian said. That's the part I've been trying to understand. Whether you know the difference between what was necessary and what you wanted. Declan set the glass down again, harder this time. What I wanted, he repeated. You want to have that conversation? Fine. Yes. I made calculations about what your decisions meant for the family structure, for the estate, for the position I've spent my entire career building inside a family that has always defaulted to you. Is that what you need me to say? I need you to understand what it cost, Adrian said. Not to me. To her. Declan looked at him. She spent 22 weeks alone, Adrian said, pregnant with twins. She thought I'd said what I said because I meant it. She thought I had walked away. She built her entire plan for the future around the assumption that she had been correctly abandoned, because that was the only information she had access to, because you made sure she had no other information. His voice remained flat and controlled, and it cost him something to keep it that way. She could have told him that, could have told him what it looked like when he worked to stay level, because she'd learned to read it. You didn't just take letters. You took her ability to make an informed decision. You took 22 weeks of her life and turned them into something she had to manage alone. Declan said nothing. I'm not here to make you feel the appropriate amount of guilt, Adrian said. I don't think guilt is actually in your vocabulary in the way it needs to be for that to work. I'm here because you're my brother, and because I needed to say this to your face rather than through attorneys, and because when the investigators sit down with you in 48 hours, I need you to have heard this first. He paused. Tell them the truth. All of it. About the letters, about Rourke, about the records. Don't protect the firm, don't protect Mother. Tell them what you did and why. Declan's expression was difficult to read. You know what that means for the family. Yes. The Hargrove agreement collapses. It was already gone the moment I made that statement, Adrian said. I knew that when I made it. Mother will manage, Adrian said. She always does. That's what she's best at. He picked up his coat from the back of the chair where he'd set it when he came in. I'm going to be a father, Declan. In approximately 17 weeks, I'm going to have 2 children, and I'm going to be present for every part of that. And I am going to build something that is not built on what this family has been built on. I'm offering you the option of being part of that. Not this, he gestured briefly, at the room around them, at the expensive impersonality of it, but something that is actually a family. That offer is available. What it requires is that you stop, right now, doing what you've been doing. Declan stood very still. And if I don't, he said, then you face the investigation with whatever Rourke can build for you, Adrian said. And you do it knowing that I will cooperate fully with every aspect of it, because Elena and my children are the priority now, and there is nothing in this family's interest that outranks them. He looked at his brother for a long moment. I love you. That's not nothing, and I'm not going to pretend it is, but it's not sufficient anymore to make me look away. He left. He took the elevator down 31 floors and walked out of the building and stood on the sidewalk in the November air and breathed slowly, the way you breathed when you'd said the necessary thing and were now on the other side of it with nothing to do but live in what you'd set in motion. He called Elena. It's done, he said. A pause. How is he? The question surprised him. He stood on the sidewalk and thought about it honestly. Cornered, he said. which is the most dangerous version of him. But I think he stopped, chose the words carefully. I think he heard it. Okay, she said. Are you at Danny's? Yes. I'll come tomorrow, he said, if that's all right. A longer pause. That's all right, she said. She ate that. He stood on the sidewalk another minute before he moved, letting the city do its indifferent and continuous thing around him, and he thought about 22 weeks of letters that never arrived, and the pen on the side table, and the ultrasound image in his coat pocket, and he understood, in the particular way that things became understood when they had cost enough to teach you, that the life he was walking toward was not going to be clean or uncomplicated or built on anything that resembled the architecture he'd been raised inside. It was going to be built on what was true instead. That was harder. It was also the only thing he wanted. Declan cooperated with the federal investigation. He did it without his mother's knowledge and against Rourke's explicit advice. And it happened on a Tuesday morning, 2 days after Adrian left his apartment. And it came out later that what moved him wasn't fear of the evidence against him, which was substantial, but something that Declan himself, in a rare moment of something approaching candor, described to his own attorney as a decision that had become overdue. The attorney had reportedly not known what to do with that and had moved quickly back to procedural matters. James Rourke's firm was referred for a separate disciplinary proceeding. Margaret Ashcroft made no public statement about the investigation, which was itself a statement, and she retreated to the Connecticut property for several weeks in a silence that her household staff described as precise and unbroken. The Hargrove Agreement was formally withdrawn in the third week of November. Thomas Vega kept his position. Adrian restructured his role with a significant increase in compensation and a title that reflected his actual responsibilities, and Thomas accepted it with the same quiet efficiency with which he approached everything, and he did not mention the pen again. Elena went back to room 14. She went back the Monday after the investigation opened because 23 children still needed a teacher and the world continued to decline to pause itself for her particular circumstances. She was 23 weeks pregnant, and visibly so, and she had made the announcement to her class on a Thursday before the week off with the specific warmth and directness she used for all important information. 2 children had asked if it was 1 baby or 2. She had said 2. There had been a brief and spectacular outbreak of excitement that had taken several minutes to settle, and one child named Phoebe had immediately declared that she would make them something and had produced the following Monday 2 pipe cleaner figures with yarn hair that she presented with enormous solemnity. Elena had put them on her desk where they remained. She and Adrian moved carefully. That was the only accurate description of it. Careful, deliberate. The way you moved through a space you'd been through before and knew had structural damage that hadn't been fully repaired. He came to Danny's that first Sunday with coffee and the particular demeanor of a man who understood he was a guest in a situation that had not yet been resolved. And Ray shook his hand, and Danny examined him with the frank and specific attention of an older sister conducting an evaluation that would not be disguised as anything else. He sat at the kitchen table, and he answered questions, and he did not deflect or produce the polished version of himself. And at the end of it, Danny said, "Okay," in the tone that meant she had reached a provisional conclusion and would be revisiting it regularly. He came to Elena's apartment the following weekend with nothing except himself, which was the right choice. They sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd read his emails, where she'd sat the night Declan called, where she'd made the decisions that had gotten her to this specific Saturday morning. And they talked with the kind of honesty that was difficult not because people didn't want it, but because they weren't practiced in it. Having spent most of their time together previously in the compressed time of new love, where honesty was a thing you offered in curated portions rather than all at once. She told him what the 22 weeks had actually been. Not the functional version, the attorney calls, the strategic decisions, the deliberate management, but the other version. The bathroom floor, the supply closet, the pre-dawn hours when she'd lain in the dark and pressed her hands to her stomach and run the math on what she had versus what she needed, and felt the gap between them in her chest like a physical thing. She told him about Phoebe's pipe cleaner figures, and about the morning she'd spent an hour in her car outside the building before she could make herself go in, and about the specific loneliness of carrying something enormous and having nowhere to put the weight of it. He listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. He did not rush to apologize or explain because she was not telling him in order to receive those things. She was telling him because he had asked her once to let him know what the truth actually was, and she had decided, finally, to take him at his word. When she finished, he reached across the table and put his hand over hers. He didn't say anything. She looked at his hand on hers and thought about her mother doing the same thing months ago at a different kitchen table, and she let the feeling come up and be what it was rather than managing it. "I need you to understand something," she said, when the feeling had settled enough to make room for words. "I am not the same person I was before the dinner. I'm not saying that as an accusation. I'm saying it as a fact you need to work with. The woman who was going to marry you 8 months ago made decisions from a different position than I'm in now. I have 2 children to think about, and that changes the math on every single thing, including trust, including time, including what I'm willing to accept and what I'm not." "I understand," he said. "I need you to prove it over time," she said. "Not in a grand gesture, in the accumulation of small ones. Show up when you say you will. Tell me the truth when it's inconvenient. Don't make decisions about my life without asking me first, ever, for any reason, regardless of how good the reason seems." "I can do that," he said. "You can try," she said. "Doing it is different." He looked at her for a moment. "Fair," he said. She turned her hand over under his and held it. They went to the 26-week appointment together. Dr. Park conducted the ultrasound with the same precise warmth she brought to everything, and Elena watched Adrian's face as the heartbeats came through the room. The same sound she'd been carrying alone for months, now audible to both of them. And she watched him absorb it, the specific weight of something real making itself known through sound. His jaw was tight, and his eyes were bright, and he didn't try to compose his face into anything presentable, which was the most honest she'd seen him look in a room that wasn't a crisis. "They're both still measuring well," Dr. Park said. "Twin A is slightly more active." She moved the wand. "Twin B appears to be sleeping." "That tracks," Elena said. Adrian looked at her. She did not explain the comment because it did not require explanation, and the fact that it didn't require explanation meant something. The months moved. Not easily. Nothing about the legal proceedings was easy, and the press found the story and held on to it with the specific appetite of outlets that understood the combination of wealth and scandal, and a pregnancy functioned as a nearly self-sustaining news cycle. Rosario managed what could be managed. Elena did not speak publicly, not once, which was a decision she had made at the outset and held to regardless of what was printed, because the story she was living was not a story she owed anyone, and the only audience that mattered was sitting in Dr. Park's office measuring well at regular intervals. Margaret Ashcroft came to her once more, not to Rosario's office this time, to the Carroll Gardens apartment on a Wednesday evening in January when the cold had settled into the city and made it specific and particular in the way that January cold in New York was specific and particular. Elena opened the door because she had known, since the investigation had moved through its various stages, that this conversation would come, and she had decided she was ready for it. Margaret stood in her doorway and looked at her, and then at the visible evidence of the pregnancy, which at 31 weeks was comprehensive and beyond management. "I'm not here to negotiate," Margaret said. "Good," Elena said. "Come in." She made tea because she was going to be in her own apartment on her own terms, and she set a cup in front of Margaret and sat across from her and waited. Margaret looked around the apartment slowly. At the children's books stacked on the side table, at the pipe cleaner figures on the shelf Elena had moved from her desk at school, at the single photograph on the wall, Elena and her mother and Danny at a beach in Cape May 3 summers ago. Nothing remarkable about it except that everyone in it was laughing at something outside the frame. "My son," Margaret said finally, "is not a man who apologizes. He was not raised that way. Neither was Declan." "I know," Elena said. "He's trying," Margaret said. It cost her something to say it. Elena could see the cost. "I know that too," Elena said. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. The expression on her face was not warmth. Elena didn't expect warmth, wasn't looking for it, had stopped needing it some months ago. It was something more austere than that, and in some ways more useful. It was recognition. The specific recognition of one woman by another who has understood that the situation has resolved in a direction that cannot be reversed. "The children will be Ashcrofts," Margaret said. "They'll be Ashcrofts and Whitlocks," Elena said. "Both things, fully. Not one thing with the other one reduced." A long silence. "Fine," Margaret said. It was not a concession made with grace. It was a concession made with the acknowledgement that the alternative was to be entirely outside of a future that was happening regardless. And Margaret Ashcroft had never been a woman who chose absence when presence, even altered and humbled presence, was available. She drank her tea. She left without ceremony. Elena stood at the window and watched the car pull away from the curb below and felt, not triumph, but something quieter and more durable. The specific satisfaction of having stood in the path of a force that assumed she would move and having not moved. She went to her sister's house for dinner that night. Ray made the thing he made when occasions required it, a slow-cooked short rib that had been his grandmother's recipe and that he produced with enormous seriousness and no shortcuts. And Clara Whitlock was at the table because she was always at the table for the things that mattered, and Adrian came because Elena had asked him. And he sat next to her mother and answered questions about his plans with the careful specificity of a man who understood that Clara Whitlock's approval could not be managed, only earned, and who had decided that earning it was worth whatever it required. At some point during the evening, Clara put her hand over Adrian's on the table, briefly, in the same gesture she had used with Elena months ago in the kitchen in Flatbush, and she said, "She doesn't need protecting from the world. She needs someone who stays in it with her." Adrian looked at Clara for a moment. "I understand that now," he said. "Good," Clara said, and she went back to her food. The twins arrived on a Thursday evening in late March, which came in cold and clear, the kind of night that felt deliberate rather than accidental. Elena had called it at home, calmly, sitting on the edge of her bed with her coat already on because she had packed the bag 2 weeks ago, and she was not going to be the person who panicked. And she had called Adrian first and Danny second, and her mother third, which was an ordering that she had not consciously decided, but which turned out to be the correct one, and which told her something about where she had landed. The labor was long and not easy. She had known it would not be easy. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything that mattered, with complete information and no illusions. Adrian was there for all of it, through the hours that were hard and the hours that were harder, and he held her hand when she wanted it and stayed out of the way when she didn't, and he did not say the wrong thing, which was not a small achievement across 9 hours of difficulty. Twin A arrived first, at 11:47 in the evening, with a sound that was immediate and definitive and caused Adrian to make a sound of his own that he did not attempt to contain or manage. Twin B followed 11 minutes later, more reluctant, which Dr. Park noted with mild amusement was consistent with the ultrasound evidence. They were placed on Elena's chest within minutes of each other, one and then the other, warm and real and smaller than she'd imagined, even though she'd imagined it extensively. And she looked down at them with the specific knowledge that this was the thing everything else had been in the service of. Not the legal proceedings or the decisions or the carefully managed silences, but these two particular lives that had been there through all of it. Adrian sat on the edge of the bed beside her. He was not composed. She had not expected him to be. "Hi," he said to both of them. Just that. He looked at their faces with the expression of a man being introduced to something he had not known was possible to feel. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that arrived after hours of effort, when the effort was done and what remained was simply what had been produced by it, real and specific and present. Elena looked at the window. The first gray of approaching morning was beginning to separate itself from the dark, the horizon line becoming distinct, the city below reassembling its geometry in the early light. She looked at the two small faces against her chest and thought about October in Carroll Gardens, and a hallway outside a house, and a fountain pen she'd saved 3 months to buy and left on a table. And she thought about 47 emails and a photograph with a timestamp and a kitchen table where she'd made the decision that had brought her here. And she understood, with the quiet and non-negotiable certainty of a woman who had been through the thing and come out on the other side of it, that the story was not the hurt. The hurt was just the root. The story was this room, this morning, these two lives and the people in the room who were going to be responsible for them and were ready now, imperfect and changed and ready. She looked at Adrian. He looked at her. No performance between them, no architecture, just two people on the other side of the true cost of the thing, holding what they'd managed to build from what had been broken. "Okay," she said quietly. He nodded. His hand found hers. Outside, the March light continued to arrive, slow and certain, over the city that had held all of it. The leaving and the searching, the silence and the letters, the hallway and the hospital room. Without pausing once, without knowing, as it always did, moving forward the only way anything moved, which was one irreversible moment at a time.